From Nashville, Tennessee, this is Mysterious Matters, for those who dare to think. And joining us this evening is Robert Damon Schneck. Robert is a longtime chronicler of the weird and the unexplained. He has written about everything from killer clowns to suicide clubs. And today Robert will be coming on to discuss the Bye-Bye Man and other strange but true tales. And without further ado, Robert, welcome to Mysterious Matters.
Hi, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to finally have you here. We've been trying to do this for quite a while now.
I think it's a few weeks by now.
It's got to be at least a few weeks. Now, as I discussed at the beginning of this show, you have a book out titled The Bye-Bye Man and Other Strange But True Tales. And The Bye-Bye Man is actually becoming a motion picture. What can you tell us about how you came across the story of the Bye-Bye Man?
Most of my stories come from American history. I consider myself primarily an historian, not a paranormalist. You know, I've gone on the occasional ghost hunt, and I've hung around people who were standing in a cemetery asking if anyone was there and things like that. But again, my approach is primarily as an historian. Mm-hmm. The story of the Bye-Bye Man is an exception. It is nothing like what I usually write. I first heard it at a friend's Devil's Night party. I have a friend who gives a party the night before Halloween every year. And these parties always conclude the same way. He invites all the guests who have had a spooky or paranormal experience and are willing to talk about it to tell their story. And when everyone's told their story, he then tells the story of what happened to him and three friends in Wisconsin back in 1990. And it was the story of the Bye-Bye Man. That's where I first heard it. And I have heard hundreds of weird stories. I've heard ghost stories, monster stories, flying saucers, Bigfoot, all kinds of stories. I've even heard vampire stories and demon stories. But of all the stories that I've heard, none spooked me the way the Bye-Bye Man did. It got under my skin. It's the only story to ever do that. So when that happened, I figured this is something special. I knew it was something special when I heard it. Part of it was just the name, the Bye-Bye Man. It sounds like something out of folklore, but this wasn't folklore. This story, do you want me just to tell the story of what happened?
You can if you would like.
Sure. Well, as I said, I heard the story from one of the three people that it happened to. And they were three college students living in Wisconsin in 1990. My friend, whose name is Eli, he's the one who gave the parties, his girlfriend, whose name was Catherine, and a mutual friend of theirs named Jonathan. Now, it was winter in Wisconsin, and the winters there are long, and they didn't have much to do in the evenings. So when somebody made them a gift of an old Ouija board that was found in an attic, they decided to do some experiments. Now, my friend Eli is very interested in parapsychology. In fact, at one time, he was the librarian at the American Society for Psychical Research. That's how interested he is in the subject. And he's always been fascinated by things like legend tripping and urban legends. I think he has a degree in folklore. That's how interested he is in the subject. So when they got a hold of this old Ouija board, he decided that they should try to do some experiments. First, they would see if they could get any sort of communication of any kind. Now, he tried moving the planchette. They had to buy a new Ouija board because they didn't have a planchette for the old one. And for listeners, the planchette's the little table, the little pointer that you use when you're trying to get messages from the Ouija board. And typically, the way it works is the people sitting around the Ouija board will rest their fingers very gently on the planchette, and it will eventually start to move and either point out letters or show the letters in that little porthole that's in the middle. I've heard that it's the porthole, but I've never understood why, if you're supposed to use the porthole, why it has a point to it. But that's another story. Anyway, Eli and Catherine were unable to get any results. This didn't surprise anyone because nothing ever happens around Eli. He could go to a ghost hunt every night. Nothing would ever happen. Nothing happens around him. And eventually, Jonathan and Catherine began to work with the planchette, and they got results. Apparently, Catherine, if anyone of the group could be described as a medium, it would have been Catherine, because she was fascinated by it, and they began to get messages. And the messages were a little different. They weren't just, it wasn't the sort of thing where they asked somebody if they were there and then asked them questions and either got responses or didn't. What happened was kind of interesting. The board had something that called itself the spirit of the board, and it acted a little bit like the spirit guide or control that mediums use in seances. So what they would do is first they would contact the spirit of the board, and then the spirit of the board would introduce them to other spirits. At least that's what it said it was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the spirits that they contacted were nice. None of them had ever been human. They were all always spiritual beings, and they were kind of pleasant, new agey stuff, light and life and crystals and granola and all that stuff. And it was very pleasant. Well, Eli was getting bored with that. So he said, let's do another experiment. Let's see if you can get results with the two of you blindfolded. And they did that, and they got results. They still got messages through. And then he said, well, let's try it with all the lights off and both of you blindfolded, and I'll just use a pen light to see if we can get answers. And they still got results, and he kept a journal of all the notes that he took, which, of course, like everything in a story like this, was eventually lost. Anyway, he decided then, let's take the experiment a little further. I will write a question down in my notebook, concentrate on it, and see if the two of you can get the answer. The idea being that maybe the spirits could read his mind and would be able to communicate an answer. They didn't get great results with that. They got a few kind of results. But Eli decided, let's try it a little further. And the idea he had was, let's see if we can contact the spirit of someone who died, not a spirit that never lived, but the spirit of someone who lived and died. And let's see if we can get information from this spirit that we can verify. So, for example, if they're told that if they somehow get in contact with Joe Bloggs, who claims to have been born in 1800 and to have died in 1888, and to have lived at a certain place, presumably they should be able to find this information in the census or some other source of information. It seemed like a reasonable experiment. And they didn't have any luck with this, but the spirit of the board told them that there was a living being who wanted to contact them, but that this living being was very evil, and the spirit didn't want anything to do with it. Well, that did it for Eli. When he heard that this was very evil, his ears went up. That sparked his interest, because he loves horror, and he's actually interested in the science of fear. What makes something scary?
Interesting.
So he said, well, let's pursue this. Let's see if we can get in contact with this. The spirit of the board was very unwilling, but it loved communicating. So what they did was they went on strike. They said they would no longer communicate with the spirit of the board unless it put them in contact with this evil being, this evil living being.
Wow.
Well, messages began to come through in dribs and drabs. And over a period of weeks, they assembled a full story of this being who called himself the Bye-Bye Man. Now, the story that came through the Ouija board was this. The Bye Bye Man said that he had been born in Louisiana sometime in the 1920s, and he had been born an albino. His parents, or parent, that we don't know anything about his parents, put him in an orphanage in Algiers. Now, they didn't know where Algiers was. They apparently assumed that it was a village in Louisiana, probably because of the movie Angel Heart, where Algiers is portrayed that way. But Algiers is actually one of the districts of New Orleans. It's the only part of New Orleans that isn't attached to the main city. It's on the other side of the river. And it's a railroad and industrial hub. It's not rural. It's not a bayou. It's not things like that. But again, that's where the Bye Bye Man said that he was put into this orphanage. Now, as he grew older, he kept trying to escape from the orphanage. And finally, but they always brought him back. He was blind. But he was finally, as he got older, he took a pair of scissors and attacked one of the nurses. And he hurt her very badly, almost killed her. But he did finally escape. And he began to ride the rails like a hobo. Now, according to the story, mutilated bodies began to turn up by the railroad tracks, and they were mutilated in a peculiar way. Their eyes and their tongues were missing. And apparently, what the Bye Bye Man had done was somehow acquired some form of black magic, or since it was New Orleans, let's say voodoo or voodoo. And what he was doing was he was taking the eyes and the tongues and cutting them out and saving them in a bag or a sack, which was his bag of gore or sack of gore that he carried with him. And what he did with the pieces was he sewed them together and then somehow brought this lump of dead tongues and eyes, he brought it to life. And it became a little creature that accompanied him, a little monster called Gloomsinger, that was all tongues and eyes. And again, name was Gloomsinger. Now, what the Bye Bye Man used Gloomsinger for was kind of interesting. When someone learned the name, the Bye Bye Man, it transformed their mind into a kind of psychic beacon, so that as long as they thought of the name, as long as they thought about the Bye Bye Man, the Bye Bye Man knew where they were, and he would begin to ride the rails in their direction. He would keep riding for as long as they thought about him. And when he got close enough, he then used Gloomsinger to locate them. And with all those eyes and with all those tongues, Gloomsinger was able to see them, apparently. And when he got close enough, Gloomsinger would let off this shrill whistle. And that would bring the Bye Bye Man close enough so that he could close with his victim, kill them, and take their tongues and eyes.
Mm-hmm. You would think that Gloomsinger would be a bit slow considering he's nothing but tongues and eyes.
Yes, but I'm just reporting.
Yeah.
Maybe part of coming to life was that it gave him a little more pep than your average creature made of tongues and eyes.
Hey, I can see this creature right now walking with the tongues. That's what he's doing.
Yeah, just like little things, like
little
something
tentacles
in the ocean. Yeah, like
Yes.
something that's underwater. Anyway, and the spirit finally reported that the Bye Bye Man had latched on to the three of them and that he was starting to move towards them. Well, when Catherine heard that, she was done. She wanted nothing more to do with these seances. She had a history of paranormal experiences, and they frightened her, which is why she was enjoying the nice little remarks that were coming through from the spirits. But when this came through, she was finished. And like I said, she seems to have been the medium of the group. So Jonathan and Eli were unable to get any more messages. That seemed to have put an end to the experiment, but it didn't really. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan went back to school in Madison, Wisconsin, and they were in Sun Prairie, and Catherine was unable to sleep. She was having nightmares. She was having panic attacks. She was getting up at night, and it was starting to wear her out. She was exhausted. So finally, Eli said, well, why don't we go to my hometown of Wausau, which is where it's famous for its insurance company. And he took her there on a nice summer day to go to a concert. Well, the concert was in the evening, so they had the afternoon to themselves, and they were walking around Wausau. And one of the places to go see in Wausau is something called Barker Stewart Island. Barker Stewart Island is an island in the Wisconsin River that is nicknamed Body Island. And it's nicknamed Body Island because lumberjacks that would drown upstream would sometimes wash up on Body Island back in the old days when there was a lot of lumbering going on in that section of Wisconsin. But also on Barker Stewart or Body Island is a railroad bridge. And it's a kind of a neat old railroad bridge. I've seen it. So they were walking around by the river. Eli went down to the river. He said he wanted to look at a turtle or something that he saw down there. And Catherine was walking along the railroad bridge by herself. And it was at that point that she heard a whistle. Now, hearing a whistle on a railroad bridge is not strange. It was an active railroad bridge. It could have been a train whistle, but it wasn't. She said it was a shrill, human-sounding whistle, and it terrified her. She ran off that bridge, had a terrific panic attack, and kept having panic attacks for the rest of the day. I don't know if that was what broke them up, but Eli and Catherine broke up soon after that. Eli then went to go visit Jonathan in Madison. Jonathan also had been having trouble sleeping. He had been having the same things, nightmares, inability to sleep, waking up all the time. But he had one experience that finally put a cap on everything. He was lying in bed, and it was dark. He couldn't sleep. And he hears a knocking on the door, and he hears Catherine's voice saying, "Come on, Jonathan, we're here. Come on, let's go get breakfast." So he gets up and he starts to slowly get dressed. When he looks out the window and he realizes it's pitch dark, and he checks his clock, and it's the middle of the night. And he continues to hear Catherine's voice knocking, saying, "Come on, Jonathan, open the door. Let's go have breakfast." And the knocking continues on the door. Well, he was living on the third floor of a boarding house, and presumably the door was locked at night. And it's unlikely that Catherine would have showed up in the middle of the night to go have breakfast. And he crumbled. He just slid to the floor. And in that slit of light under the door, he could see the shadows of 2 feet out the hallway. And the knocking continued, and the voice kept saying, "Let's go have breakfast." But eventually, when he didn't respond, it went away. It was an utterly terrifying experience for him. Now, it wasn't long after that he and Catherine began dating. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but the two of them wanted nothing more to do with the story. In fact, when it turned out that people wanted to make it into a film, I had to get releases from Catherine and Jonathan. And Jonathan was fine. He just signed a release. And there was a question of, well, did they want to be reimbursed and all that? Catherine said no, she didn't want a penny. She just didn't want to have anything to do with it. She signed the release, but that was it. She wanted nothing to do with this project. And Eli was great. He said, he knows I'm a writer, so any money I make, he says, you can just keep it. So I was able to get releases from all of them. But the story would have ended there, except the fact that Eli is a storyteller. And he loves to tell stories. And he had the Devil's Night where he began to tell the story, and it became a tradition. Now, the story that he told became embroidered over the years. He admitted that he would change it here and there. He would tweak it. He would try to make it either a little more logical or a little scarier. But when it came time for me to write it, he tried to get it back to as close to the original as he could possibly remember. And that was what ended up going into the book. Now, I told this story on the radio a lot. This is the most popular story I have ever written. And I've written dozens of stories, but this is the one that people remember. And when I told it on the radio, someone in Hollywood heard it. And it was after that that, we were getting, suddenly I was getting contracts to sign and agents to talk to. And it was very exciting, but certainly never thought anything would come of it.
Mm-hmm.
And a few years later, lo and behold, a friend of mine calls me and says, your name is in Variety? And I said, why is my name in Variety? And that was when they announced that the movie was actually going to be made. And once they announced it, everything went very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And now in December, the movie's going to be coming out. So it's going to be quite an experience.
Yes.
I'm going to go out, I'm going to walk on a red carpet. It's it's very outside of my experience. I'm a writer. I never leave the house.
Yes.
So going to a Hollywood movie opening is going to be quite something different.
Yes. Are your friends going to be joining you?
I get well, like I said, Catherine wants nothing more to do with it.
She won't even watch the movie.
As far as I know, she probably won't. The experience terrified her. Jonathan probably will, but I'll be honest, he's difficult to get a hold of. The last I spoke to him, and that was a few years ago, he was working as a long haul trucker. So it's difficult to get a handle on, to get a hold of him. Eli, I'm sure, will go see it, but they're only giving me one ticket and for a friend, so it's for us to go out there.
Yeah.
But that, like I said, that'll be quite an experience. Getting to meet the people, because I actually know some of the people who I know them from movies because I'm a big horror movie fan. So getting to meet Doug Jones and getting to meet Faye Dunaway is just, that's going to be very exciting.
Oh,
I hope she's there.
In all the years you've been speaking about the Bye-Bye Man, have you ever felt uneasy, or that maybe somebody was watching you or intended on causing you harm?
No, I've never had that feeling. And I'll tell you that part of that comes from what I did when I was working on the story. I never think of him as the Bye-Bye Man. I always think of him as the BBM. Mentally, that's my name for him. So it's only when I do this sort of show that I say the name out loud. And besides, if I'm turning thousands of people into psychic beacons, it raises the odds that he's going to get to me first. And when the movie comes out, that'll be millions of people.
Yes.
So the odds get even better.
What does the Bye-Bye Man look like?
Well, if I remember correctly, he's tall and thin, and he wears a broad-brimmed hat. Of course, he's an albino, so he's deadly white. He has long hair. He wears a pair of dark glasses that are painted black on the inside. He wears a kind of a navy peacoat, is how they described it to me. And he travels like a tramp, but I don't think he quite looks like a tramp. I don't know. He might. And of course, he carries that bag. And although there's no mention of any kind of a weapon, for some reason, I've always assumed it might be that pair of scissors that he used to injure the nurse back in the orphanage. Now, I did research, and I was unable to verify any of the story. As far as I know, there never was an orphanage in Algiers. There was an orphanage in a place called Gretna, but that's not Algiers. That's up the river. And there was a special needs school in Algiers, but that didn't show up until the 1960s. So that wouldn't have been right, because the Bye-Bye Man, of course, was blind, and he could have gone to a school like that. But chronologically, it doesn't work. The only thing I could think of that does kind of fit the story, and even that doesn't fit the story too well, are all the railroad-connected murders that happened in the 1920s and the 1930s, when a lot of people were being killed by somebody with an axe, and their houses were almost always very close to railroad tracks. Or the famous Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, who murdered people in Cleveland in the 1930s and was notorious for chopping their heads off.
Mm.
So no mention of tongues and eyes in that. And sometimes the heads were found and the tongues and eyes were there, or if they were missing, there's no mention of that being especially meaningful. Although strangely enough, they actually did shoot the movie The Bye-Bye Man in Cleveland, where the Cleveland butcher worked.
Mm.
So there's a little bit of coincidence working there.
Well, one thing I know from speaking with Ouija experts such as Karen Dahlman, etc., is that sometimes you'll get a mixed signal. You'll get 2 or 3 different types of messages from multiple individuals on the other side. Of course, there's also the jokesters, those people who will just give you messages to pull your legs.
Mm-hmm.
So it might not be that the messages they were receiving were accurate messages, but rather maybe a joke or multiple messages jarring together.
Certainly, it's possible. I must admit that I'm inclined to think that the source of the story was the 3 of them. I think that they were, something to remember is that this was not a laboratory experiment. This was 3 friends during a long winter who were experimenting with a Ouija board and talking about it. I think they developed the story among themselves, and then it came out through the Ouija board. I think that some of the elements of it, for example, that strong element of folklore. Remember that Eli has a degree in folklore.
Mm-hmm.
I think he probably had a big influence on shaping this story. I think that it was not something that they came up with consciously. I think it is something that some part of their brain or brains collectively put together. Probably Catherine had a lot to do with it, is what I'm thinking. And that the story was a group effort. I'll give you an example of something that I think might be comparable to it. I once attended a meeting of something called the Intruders Foundation. And that was the group that Bud Hopkins ran for people that believed they had been abducted. And I attended this meeting, and there were lots of people there. Probably around 200 people were there. Most of whom, if not all of whom, except for myself, believed that they had been abducted. And there was a person giving a speech describing their abduction experiences and talking about what had happened to them and certain things that made their experience exceptional, which is why they wrote a book about it. And at one point, David Jacobs, who is also pretty famous in abduction circles or notorious in abduction circles, depending on who you read, he stood up at one point and he said that he was looking for information on the kinds of toys that the human alien hybrid babies play with in the orbiting motherships where supposedly the alien hybrids are being bred for some reason. I don't know why. But when he said that, I thought to myself, I am surrounded by 200 people who are now going to begin scouring their memories for something that has just been suggested to them. And that a lot of them are going to find them, even though they never thought about this before, even though it never occurred to them before, it had never been a part of their abduction memory before, but David Jacobs had just introduced it. So I think that what is going on, at least in the case of what I saw, was that a kind of group narrative was being put together with people, with men like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs directing that narrative, acting almost like editors, while all of these people were contributing experiences, aspects of it that they hadn't thought of, some of which would be accepted, some of which would be rejected by the group, and that this story was, that a narrative was actually being created before my eyes. And I think something similar might have happened with the creation of the Bye-Bye Man, that the 3 of them created this narrative. And I think, for example, the way that they depicted Algiers reflected what they saw in the movie Angel Heart. At least that's one possibility. and a movie that had elements of voodoo and murder and it was a pretty bizarre film. So I think that might have influenced the way might have added an element to the film, to the Ouija board story.
Mm-hmm.
Something else, of course, that's interesting is I don't believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't believe that any film has ever had a Ouija board story as its original teller. I don't feel quite as connected to this story as I do to a lot of my other stories because I'm really just one person in a chain of storytellers. First, the Ouija board told the story. Then Eli tells the story at his Devil's Night parties, and that's where I heard it. Then I tell the story and I put it in print. And then thousands of people read about it. And some of those people, and I also tell the story on the radio, which is a slightly streamlined version of the story because I can't go into all the details. It would be very unwieldy to tell the story. So it's a slightly streamlined version of it. But then people hear my version of the story, and now someone in Hollywood is going to be telling their version of the story. So like I said, I'm just one in a chain of people. And again, that's why I can be a little. I'm not going to stand up and scream, "They murdered my baby," if the film doesn't follow my story that closely.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't expect it to.
And usually it doesn't. The book is usually better than the movie.
Well, it's not even a question. In this case, I wouldn't even say it's a question of better because the story is unwieldy. And like so many true or more or less true stories that involve paranormal elements, it doesn't have a neat wrap up. It just kind of stopped and the people went on with their lives. Some of them tried to forget it. Some of them enjoyed it, remembered it. But like most of the stories that I've heard, they don't have a satisfying ending. So I'm sure that when the film comes out, first of all, they are going to have to streamline the story, make it appropriate to film, because it's got to be told with pictures. It's got to be told with action and images. There's not going to be the chance to go off and explore some of the aspects of it that I was able to do in the book. And they've got to come up with a satisfying story. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they completely streamlined it, because again, it's just unwieldy and it doesn't lend itself to a flow, to an easy flow that makes a lot of sense.
Yes. So I guess you would say that the Bye Bye Man, in your opinion, would be, as far as being truthful goes, it has a high probability of being fiction.
Let's say that I think that the story that came through the Ouija board was an artifact of three people telling stories.
Okay.
But let's take it a little further. Let's say that Jonathan's experience was not a dream, and that Catherine's experience on the railroad bridge was not some weird little fluke of her hearing or something odd like that. Let's say that those were both genuine experiences. Well, then we have a question of how do we explain this? And one possibility goes back to the example I always give was one of the most interesting parapsychology experiments ever performed, which was the Philip experiment.
Yes.
And for listeners, rather, oh God, I'm so used to saying readers. For listeners that aren't familiar with the Philip experiment, I'll give a quick rundown on it. And that is that in 1972, the Society for Psychical Research in Toronto decided that they were going to try to create seance room phenomena in full light and without anyone acting as a medium or someone who claimed to have special powers. That it was just going to be a group of people who were open-minded on the possibility of seance phenomena, and they were going to see if they could create it. And the way they went about it was by creating a character that they named Philip. Now, to avoid the possibility of a genuine spirit showing up in their seances, they created Philip as a mixture of history and fiction. They came up with a legend of Philip, where he falls in love with a gypsy maiden, and his cold wife finds out, and she has the gypsy maiden burned at the stake. And Philip is a nobleman in England in the 16th century, and all of that was made up. But the castle where he was supposed to have lived was real, and they got pictures of it, and they claimed that Philip enjoyed fencing, so they got a sword, and they kept that in the room where they did these experiments. And they didn't get results with their first year of experimenting. How they stayed at it for a year without results is amazing to me, but they did. And with that, they just concentrated on trying to get something to happen. Well, they looked at some British parapsychologists' experiments on a similar theme, on a similar where they were also trying to get seance room phenomena. And it turned out that that air of heavy concentration was not conducive to the phenomena. What was conducive was creating sort of a lighthearted party atmosphere. And what they began doing was singing silly songs and eating candy and talking to Philip in kind of a bantering way. And as they would have their regular meetings, and they began to do this, and they began to get responses. Philip would rap out yes and no answers on the table. They began to get some table movement where it would move around the room. And once or twice, they actually got all four legs of the table to leave the floor. Philip would answer their questions. They would ask him how things were going. And if I remember correctly, they even got a little. They even tried some experiments with bending metal because, again, this was the 70s and spoon bending was very popular. Uri Geller and was doing that, and so they got some results with that, and they got them to rap on the pieces of metal. So they got some pretty impressive results, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But there was never a question of whether this was spirits. They always felt that what was going on was group PK, that is to say, group psychokinesis, that it was because this group was working together regularly, that they were, and in controlled circumstances, that they were able to create paranormal phenomena. Now, let's say that something similar was going on in Wisconsin with the three college students. They weren't working under controlled circumstances, however. So, whereas Philip would only manifest when the group was together in a specific room, using specific tables and at specific times, they hadn't done any of that, the three of them in Wisconsin. So it's possible that when something manifested, it manifested out of bounds. It's just a theory. Then that might explain, though, the whistling and Jonathan's experience with the knocking and the voice in the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is just an idea. It's the Philip experiment is a fascinating experiment. It's been replicated a few times with people creating other spirits, again, group PK, masquerading as spirits. Why it has not had a bigger impact on parapsychology, I don't know. That's one of the odd things about parapsychology, because there are people involved in the field who spend their entire lives wanting to see something paranormal happen, and yet the Philip experiment suggests that you can have paranormal phenomena on tap.
Yes.
But there's this certain resistance to using it. I have no explanation for it. As far as I know, the Philip experiment has never been debunked. It has never even really gotten all that much attention, which is bizarre considering what it suggests about the possibilities of how prayer could have possibly affect health, about how group thinking can have an effect on the external world. The implications of the Philip experiment are enormous. And, of course, there's also the phenomena of poltergeist, which some people think is something similar, where someone's thoughts and feelings are being externalized as the phenomena that are associated with poltergeist, such as rapping and object movement, things like that. So it really is a fascinating subject and deserves a lot more attention than it gets.
Mm-hmm. That was just bringing to my mind something that could also be, I guess, along the same lines of a combined consciousness creating something, manifesting something, and that is a placebo effect. People are given placebos all the time in studies or whatever, and a lot of the times they are getting the same results as individuals getting the actual medication,
Mm-hmm.
just at a lesser level. They're still feeling better.
Mm-hmm.
They still believe that they're being cured, or whatever ailment they had is going away. That they have created an event for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just truly fascinating what our consciousness can create, can manifest.
That's true. And when you go to the more occult interpretations of something like the Philip experiment, there's the belief in thought forms, or what some people like to call them tulpas,
Mm-hmm.
which is an aspect of modern occultism, although it's got roots that go way back. Um, Possibly the most famous thought form was one that Dion Fortune, the famous British mystic, created one night when she was angry about something and she was thinking about Norse mythology. And she claims to have created this evil wolf thing in her room that walked through the wall and vanished, and apparently began to cause trouble for people. And finally, she had to go through some kind of ritual to get rid of it, because it was some kind of an evil creature that she had created. And again, these in there's a very famous book by a woman who went to Tibet. Her name was Alexandra David Neal, and she claims to have created a tulpa after long process of rituals and concentration. And she created this jolly monk that followed her around and that only she could see. But the longer that this jolly monk existed, the more evil it became,
Hmm.
and the more solid it became. And eventually, other people claimed that they could see it. And again, this is just Alexandra David Neal's version of what happened. I don't know of anyone who can verify this. And that she eventually had to go through another, even longer ritual to dissolve this thought form that she had created. And she claims in her book that there is a Tibetan belief that at times these thought forms can become so real and so evil that they actually kill their creators, or they wander off and become these sort of half mad monsters, these evil spirits just wandering around the mountains, which is a spooky thought.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Certainly is.
yeah, so then, here's this other possibility. Let's say that something like the Philip experiment was true, is a real thing. Let's say that something like Alexandra David Neal's tulpas are real, or Dion Fortune's wolf is real. Maybe the Bye Bye Man does get a degree of reality from all of these people thinking about it. It's just it's hard not to go in that direction, to at least speculate about it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hope not, though.
Oh, I know. What is that? There's something going on right now. It's a really tall, shadowy figure going around.
Oh, you mean Slender Man?
Slender Man, yes.
Yeah, Slender Man's a fascinating subject. The Bye Bye Man uh, was the story of the Bye Bye Man appeared years before the story of Slender Man. Slender Man, of course, is a work of fiction. There is no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
We know who created it. He owns the copyright.
Yes.
We know the day it appeared. However, since that happened, Slender Man has become a part of American folklore. It is shown up. It is showing up everywhere. It has become so real that two girls attempted murder. They believed in it so firmly. The Bye Bye Man is somewhat similar in that he's tall and thin and white and pale. And I'll be honest with you, I was actually a little jealous when the Slender Man appeared, because my dream for the Bye Bye Man was not that it would become a Hollywood movie. That never even occurred to me. I swear to you, when I was writing it, never thought about that. What I was hoping might happen was that I would tell the story often enough that it would become a part of American folklore and that it would start to change and mutate and evolve as people told the story. And for a little while, it was starting to do that. I was monitoring it online after the book came out, and I noticed that slightly different versions were starting to appear. But when the contracts were all signed, the lawyers had all those versions taken off taken offline because it was now a they owned the option for it. So I understand why they did that. And again, though, I that was what I that was the my only ambition for the Bye Bye Man was to see him become part of American folklore. And who knows, it might still happen because unlike so many other movies that claim to be based on a true story, this one actually is.
Yes. At least partially, it's based on
Yeah.
a true story.
Well, again, I haven't seen the movie, so I
Yeah.
don't know what they did.
Well, we'll find out.
Hmm.
Now, in your book, The Bye Bye Man and Other Strange But True Tales, out of all the stories you told in this book, which one do you find to be the most frightening or maybe the most truthful?
You have to remember that I never set out to tell scary stories. That was never my goal. My interest was in finding stories that revealed something about American history, about our culture, about our history, and that showed us an angle to it that we might never have thought of,
Hmm.
that we didn't realize existed, or to take stories that already existed and find out if they were accurate, whether they were true stories, things like that. I never set out to frighten anyone. That's not even a part of my thinking. I look for oddities. I look for what's strange and exceptional, anomalous, or abnormal. That's what interests me.
Oh, okay.
And that many people find them frightening is something else. I mean, that I can't argue with.
Yes. What can you tell us about the president's vampire?
That was originally the title story of the book. The original edition of the book was called The President's Vampire, but when the movie came out, obviously
Change things.
sure, that changed things. So the title was originally The President's Vampire, and it was a story that I found in one of Charles Fort's books, where he describes a fishing boat out of Boston where the sailors began disappearing. And after the second sailor disappeared, the captain said, "All right, that's it. We are going to search this ship from top to bottom and find out what's happening." So they did. And when they got down deep into the hold, they found the dead, blood drained body of one of the missing sailors. And they found another sailor drinking the blood of the second missing sailor.
Hmm.
And this sailor was a vampire. So they put him in chains, took him back to Boston. He was put on trial, sentenced to hang, but there was some question about his sanity. So President Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, commuted his sentence to life. And he was moved to, I think, Ohio or Illinois State Prison. And then eventually he ended up at St. Elizabeth's mental asylum down in Washington, D.C., where he eventually died. Now, I thought to myself, wow, that's really interesting. I think I have found an example of an early American serial killer and of an unusual kind.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't a lot of blood drinkers out there. So I began to do research, and I, I don't think I've ever gotten as much material on any subject as I finally got on this because I ended up with so much material that I actually got the page from the captain's logbook of the day that it happened. It's written. I couldn't believe when I got that. My hands were shaking
Oh, I
when
bet.
they sent me the envelope that contained that because here it was, handwritten by either the captain or the first mate, a few hours after it happened. And as it turned out, the story that appeared in Charles Fort's book was completely wrong. I mean, wrong beyond words. I can't even begin to describe how wrong it was. What actually happened was there was no vampire. There were no disappearances. It wasn't even a fishing boat. It was a whaling boat, and it was in the Indian Ocean. And the ship's cook was a man named James Brown, the same as the singer, but he was the ship's cook, and he got into an argument with one of the sailors who was complaining about the amount of food they were getting. This ship's cook stabbed the sailor, killed him, then threw the knife overboard in an attempt to cover up the crime. Well, the captain found out what happened, put the cook in chains, brought him back to Boston. He was tried for murder, convicted, and sentenced to hang. But again, there were questions about his mental state, and he eventually ended up in St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Now, the question then becomes, how in the world does a story about what was essentially a Saturday night brawl gone bad on a ship become this bizarre story about vampires? The only thing I can think of is that the same year that the story of James Brown the vampire appeared was also the year that the story of Mercy Brown the vampire appeared.
Mm-hmm.
Mercy Brown was the vampire out on in Rhode Island who supposedly was feeding off her brother and whose body was exhumed and her organs removed and reduced to ashes and given to him to drink as a cure for what was almost certainly tuberculosis. So the only explanation I can come up with is that somehow these two Browns got crossed and we ended up with a vampire story. But there is one possible result of this story that is pure speculation. I can't prove this, but I think it would be really interesting if it turned out to be true, was that we know that Bram Stoker was collecting vampire stories for Dracula when the story of James Brown the vampire appeared in the newspapers. We know this because he has other American newspapers with clippings with other vampire stories. Now, there is a chapter in the novel Dracula where Dracula travels from Transylvania to England. And what does he do? One by one, the sailors on board the ship disappear because he's feeding on them. Now, I can't prove it, of course, but it would take somebody who was an expert on Stoker to even start doing the investigation into this. But I think it should be considered a real possibility that it was the story that Fort told that he got from a newspaper that inspired this really good section of Dracula, and a section that also translated really well into the movies with Nosferatu and Bela Lugosi's Dracula. So again, like I said, I can't prove it, but it's certainly an interesting possibility.
Yes. We were talking about Tulpas and how we can probably manifest things through our combined efforts. Over the years, from the 40s, 50s, etc., there have been science fiction movies, series, etc., about alien beings. What if, over the years, we have created an alien species that abducts human beings, that we are the creators? What do you think about that possibility?
Well, if you can accept the idea of tulpas, if you can accept the idea of thought forms, then it certainly fits. It makes more sense than beings coming from absolutely impossible distances. I'm not. It's not something that I personally believe. I think the explanation for a lot of what we call aliens and alien abduction probably is more cultural and social, and I think a lot of things have influenced it that don't require a paranormal element. But again, if you can accept the idea of something like Philip, then it opens up whole vistas of possibilities that should at least be considered.
No, it certainly does. I mean, I myself may not be real. I might be a tuppa. My parents were thinking about me, and there I was. On the back of your book, I found something very interesting, and that was that you have written about everything from killer clowns to suicide clubs. what's the killer clown? Would that be John Wayne Gacy, or is there
No,
someone else?
actually, have you ever read the works of Lauren Coleman?
I don't think so.
Well, Lauren Coleman, he's most famous for his Bigfoot books. And he just reopened his cryptozoology museum in Portland, Maine.
Hmm.
They just expanded it. It's really nice. I have to go up there and see it. But Lauren wrote a book back in the 1990s, I think, or late 80s, early 90s, called Mysterious America. And one of the chapters in the book was on phantom clowns. Now, what they were was a series of panics that occurred beginning on the East Coast and working its way west, were a series of panics where children claimed that clowns in vans were approaching them and threatening them with weapons, trying to get them into the van, chasing them. Um, there was a weird sexual element to it where some of the clowns didn't wear pants. It was a very strange story, and there was no good explanation for it because the, this was before the internet, and these were all local panics. It's not like one just led to another into the city next door. They jumped around. But anyway, these panics did occur. They were real. And no adult ever saw one of these clowns, though one adult did see the van that two children said a clown was driving, probably her own daughters. I was never really, the newspaper is not too, doesn't really say that, but the implication is there. And so that was the beginning of this, of these clown panics that still break out from time to time. When the TV show Living Color was on the air, there were a series of what they called Homie the Clown panics because there was a sort of a criminal clown on that TV show.
Homie
So
doesn't
there,
play that.
right, I never saw it, but I know about it because it plays a part in these panics. So the question that I asked was, now Lauren discovered this. He This was not a national story. It's not like Walter Cronkite came on television one night and said, well, folks, there's another clown panic, this one from Kansas City. No, that never happened. These were all local stories, and odd local stories, not the sort of thing to become national news. But he had a lot of contacts, and they sent him clippings. And as he put it together, he realized this was a panic that ran all the way from Denver to Boston. And he created a chronology of it. He chronicled it. Now, what he didn't do, and there's no reason why he had to do this, but what he didn't do was he didn't explain it. He didn't come up with a why did this happen. Now, he dismissed the usual explanations because he knew they weren't right. It wasn't John Wayne Gacy because that might have influenced it, but it wasn't Pennywise the Clown because Stephen King's book It didn't come out till years later. And there was the van element and just a bunch of things. It was a very weird story. So I began to wonder, well, where did it come from? And I'm under the impression, and it's complicated, so I'll give a real simple version of it. I think it comes out of black folklore, American black folklore, and I think it actually came from something that was going on during the Atlanta child killings, which happened right before these panics started, where dozens of children in Atlanta disappeared and were later found murdered.
Hmm.
And a folklore, eventually a man named Wayne Williams was convicted of murdering actually older adults, but they felt that the murders seemed to stop after he was arrested. So they believe that he was responsible for many of the murders. Anyway, while these murders were going on, they created a folklore of their own where a lot of black residents of Atlanta and white residents, I later found out, believed that the children were being kidnapped and taken to labs at the Center of the Disease Control, where their um, sexual organs were being used to create a medicine for cancer treatment. And as crazy as that story might sound, there is a long tradition of that in Black folklore, of something called the night doctors, who were believed to abduct Black people who were out late at night. They were medical students. The night doctors were medical students and medical doctors who would abduct Black people, take them back to their laboratories, and turn their blood into medicine, dissect them
Mm.
to learn about anatomy, and use them for horrible experiments. Now, the night doctors kind of overlap with the Klan, and there's a lot of Black folklore about the Klan. Now, this is going to sound kind of tenuous, but bear with me on this.
Okay.
As ridiculous as it might sound, the it was often believed in Atlanta that the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, was driving around in vans abducting Black children, and for the CDC. And is it possible that something as simple as the word Klan became clown, and that the idea of white-faced men in grotesque costumes carrying weapons, which describes the Klan as easily as it does a bunch of clowns, somehow became a part of folklore? There's a jump that occurred that I can't explain, where it went from essentially the Black community to the white community. Although a lot of the children during the clown panic were Black, so it wasn't just, it was in the white and the Black community at that point. But I believe its origin was in the Black community, and that it goes all the way back to groups that tried to keep slaves in under from wandering at night. They called them patter rollers, and then the Klan started doing that, and then the night doctors started doing that. And it's like I said, it is complicated, but I think that's the origin of it.
Hmm.
And of course, as time went on, we've developed this whole evil clown uh, image in our culture until now it's reached the point where Halloween looks almost like evil clown holiday because there are so many evil clowns and evil circus themes in it.
Yes.
But again, I think that the origin of it lies in the Atlanta child killings. John Wayne Gacy played a part. I'm not saying that he had nothing to do with it. He did. I mean, here was a man in clown costume abducting and killing boys. So, he does fit. It would be silly to deny that. But I think the main origin of it lies in Atlanta and the child murders.
Hmm. Wouldn't it be something if there was a clown killing association? Bunch of people dressed as clowns going around kidnapping and killing children.
Well, let me tell you something, Bob. There are times when I am doing this where I'm reading the stories one after the other, and I have no reason to think they're lying. And you just have to wonder sometimes, was something actually happening? Remember, that adult did see the van.
Hmm.
She didn't see the clown in the van, but she saw the van, and she never, it was not the sort of thing you lie about. There was no reason to lie about it. Of course, people will lie about anything, but it's, let's say it really did happen, then we have some explaining to do. What did these kids see?
Hmm.
I mean, I don't believe it was anything like that, for the simple reason that it's almost impossible to keep secret, especially when you have a lot of people involved for any length of time. But you can't help wondering it sometimes. Was there somebody going from city to city dressed up as a clown? And it's not like the police ignored it when the police were getting a lot of calls on these things, and party clowns who were going to work, or clowns that were delivering clowngrams, they were picked up by the police. So it's not like you could drive around like a clown and not get noticed.
Yes.
So, like I said, it is a baffling story. I tried to explain it from the position of folklore,
Hmm.
and that was all I wasn't too ambitious. I just wanted to come up with some explanation. There are some people who have really gone into the subject and come up with some fascinating things. If any of your listeners ever want to find an essay by a writer named Joseph or Joe Durwin, Durwin, he wrote a book called, I think, not a book. He wrote an essay. I think it's called "The Trickster and Calrophobia," which is the term that's now used for fear of clowns. And if you can find the essay online, and it is online, it's worth reading. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating subject. And I would not have been able to write the story that I did without Joe's help, because when he was done with his essay, he just gave me the piles of research he had done. There was an act of incredible generosity that still stuns me that someone would do that.
Hmm. I definitely believe that there is a clown conspiracy going on.
Uh huh.
I mean, the last several years there have been creepy looking clowns showing up late at night, and people will take their pictures. Have you seen those?
Yes, there's actually a term for that in folklore. It's called ostension. And ostension is when folklore inspires people to do real things. And I think what we're seeing here is an example of ostension, where the stories of killer clowns, phantom clowns, scary clowns have inspired people to actually act them out. Now, where does that go? That inspires more rumors of phantom clowns.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a kind of a circle going. Or it could also be that when it reaches the point of ostension, that the idea is going to change. It's going to evolve into something else. And there are other things similar to clowns, similar to the scary clowns in vans that have been reported around the world. In England, there were reports of a group called the Smilers, who were a little bit, well, the Smilers were supposed to drive around in vans, and when they would catch little kids, and if they would ask the little kids what their favorite football team was, and if they gave the wrong answer, they would cut their mouths and then make them scream so that the cuts would turn their mouth into a gigantic Joker type smile.
Mm.
So, there were similar things to the clown stories being told, and they show up around the world. I'll tell you the truth. The worst clown panics have not happened in the United States. They've happened down in South America, where there have been reports of where the clowns are believed to abduct children for use in organ transplants, things like that, organ thieves. And there have even been riots, if I remember correctly, groups of clowns protesting that their livelihood was being destroyed because of these awful stories, and it's a worldwide phenomenon.
And Robert, your book is The Bye Bye Man and Other Strange But True Tales.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And another book, Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist.
What's that about?
Another collection of strange but true stories. It includes chapters on people that commit suicide by chopping their own heads off, a chapter on men that screw horns into their heads, a chapter on, well, there's, of course, the story of Mrs. Wakeman, who was a cult leader whose followers chopped off a few people's heads. A lot of heads get chopped off in my books, I've noticed. The new book has a few heads being chopped off, too.
And ears being replaced, and eyes and
Oh yeah,
tongues.
there's all kinds of things going on in these books. And it's funny because when I describe my books to people, they always think I write fiction, but I don't. That requires talent. I just write nonfiction.
Over the years you've been researching, that you've been interested in these stories, what has been maybe the most fascinating story you found?
It's hard to say. Over time, your interests change.
Mm-hmm.
When I started, the thing that fascinated me more than anything else, probably because of the books I was reading, was the possibility that there could be 8 men alive in the world. Not just Bigfoot, but the other ones that are reported, like the orang pendek in Sumatra and the Ibu Gigo. What's it, the name of it? There are a lot of them from all over the world. I read Ivan Sanderson's Abominable Snowman Legend Comes to Life when I was very young, and I read Bernard Heuvelmann's On the Trail of Unknown Animals, and those two books really. The book that got me interested was Frank Edwards' Stranger Than Science. I read that when I was a little kid.
Mm.
But it was the works of Heuvelmann and Sanderson that really got me involved, seriously involved. I mean, if when I was little, I wanted to be a Bigfoot hunter. I really did. But I found out you had to go outside and stuff like that, and there's just not much Bigfoot news in New Jersey. So I developed other interests, and since I'm also fascinated by history, I combined my interest in the strange but true with my interest in history, and came up with this. I don't know if you want to call it a genre or my area of expertise,
Mm-hmm.
my area of writing, anyway.
Yes. Have you ever done any work or research on the Zodiac Killer?
I've read a few books about him. Apart from that, I don't know much. I will tell you one thing. The man who initially heard the story of the Bye Bye Man on the radio, his name was David Pryor. David Pryor has since died. He died in a car accident. And he heard the story on the radio, and he was the one who wanted to make it into a movie. And David Pryor also did two of the best documentaries I have ever seen on the Zodiac Killer. One of them in particular, where all it is, this is all that happens in the documentary, is that the men who were actually there, the cops, the victims that survived, they just sit in front of a camera and talk directly to the camera about their experiences. And it is a gripping, gripping film. Oh, you see a few little pictures of like Lake Herman Road and things like that where the stuff happened. But most of it is just these interviews. And I'm sorry I never got a chance to meet David Pryor, because I wanted to just tell him that documentaries were brilliant. I don't know how he did it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
like I said, I think they're online. You can find them somewhere online. His Zodiac documentaries, and I really recommend watching them.
Okay. And Robert, before we do head out, is there anything you would like to share with the audience as far as your website? I know you've got a movie coming out. Anything you want to share?
Sure. People that are interested in what I do and are on Facebook, or who want to contact me through Facebook, can sign up for Historian of the Strange. Like it, or however it is, you can get daily updates. And every day I post something, whether it's a book I reviewed or a lot of it's strange newspaper clippings. I've got a ton of weird newspaper clippings, strange events, things that have happened, stuff that I'm doing, things like that. I think anyone who likes what I've talked about would enjoy Historian of the Strange on Facebook. And again, you can contact me through that. And again, try the book The Bye Bye Man, and try Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist. I hope you'll enjoy them.
Mm-hmm. And they are both available through.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and you can get The Bye Bye Man as an audiobook read by Scott Brick.
Okay. I know a lot of times the audience would like to know if they can also get the book autographed.
Well, if they want to get the book autographed, probably the best thing to do would be to write to me at my email address, which is, oh my gosh, what is it? Or I'll give you the regular one because I can't remember the Gmail one. They could write to me at my regular email address, which is Damon333 at earthlink.net. And we can set something up where I can mail you a book, or you can mail me the book, and we'll go from there.
Now, Robert, at the end of every show, I usually try and ask a hypothetical question,
Hmm?
and that is, if time travel were real here and today, where would you go to and what would you do?
Oh boy. Oh, that's tough. Gosh.
Just have fun with it.
Are you okay? This is going to sound really gruesome. I'm sorry, it sounds gruesome. I want to see who Jack the Ripper was. B, I want to see who did that to the Black Dahlia. And C, I want to see the face of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. I want to know who these people were. Even if I don't know their names, I want to at least see their faces. So there are my three gruesome choices for time travel.
And that is beautiful. It fits perfectly with the show.
All right, good.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Robert Damon Schneck. And his book is The Bye-Bye Man, which you can find by going to mysteriousmatters.com/bye-bye. And for now, until the next time we do come together again, I wish you all a kind farewell.